So, to start today's agenda, I'd like to introduce on stage Mr. Eoghen O'Neill from DigiConnect of the European Commission, as we're going to have a talk with focus on Europe Startup Nation Standard and EU's innovation platform. Welcome, Owen, and thank you for joining us from Brussels.
Good morning, Mircea. Good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
So we have half an hour to discuss about these topics, and as well we can take questions from the audience in the second part of our discussion. But first, let's kick off with sharing about your experience, expertise, and what is your role in DigiConnect.
Thank you. I'm working in the Digital Innovation and Blockchain Unit of DG Connect of the European Commission. DG Connect being the service of the Commission responsible for digital policy, regulation, the digital research and innovation part of Horizon 2020. Basically, anything digital, we're on it, so to speak, in DG Connect. Specifically within the team I'm working on, I'm focusing a lot on the startup community, digital innovation, the digital outcomes of the framework program Horizon 2020, and associated with that innovation radar, which we get to talk about later. But the most recent addition to my responsibilities is a new policy initiative launched by Commissioner Thierry Breton in March this year, the EU Startup Nation Standard. This is a brand new initiative, and I look forward to talking about it with you today.
So let's hear about Europe Startup Nation Standard. I heard about it several months back when we read in the press and in the media. And let's start with the needs. What are the needs that made the Europe Startup Nation Standard proposal come to life? Where did it kick off from?
Well, one could even argue that there is no need for it, because if you look at Europe today, it's incredibly strong. It's in a really great place when it comes to startups. I mean, we've got amazing technological excellence and scientific breakthroughs coming out of research laboratories and universities across the continent. We've got growing levels of growth capital available for startups across Europe. The Atomico annual European Tech Report is showing that for the last decade, even during the pandemic year, the amount of capital being raised by European startups is growing. And that trend is continuing in 2021. We've got an amazing ecosystem across Europe, interconnected for startups. The story it keeps getting better. We've got a growing number of role models coming from the European entrepreneurial community to inspire a new generation of startups and innovators. We've got this 450 million people single market in Europe, the world's largest market in the developed world. So Europe has so many strengths, not to mention our diversity, be it in culture, history, language. And this is an incredible foundation for building startups. But there is more we can do. And that is where the EU Startup Nation Standard is stepping in. We in Brussels, in the Commission, we're launching initiatives, funding programs and so forth. But that alone is not enough, because a huge amount of what is important for startups in Europe is what member states, what countries are doing in their own national legislation, their own policies, their own programs. And if you look across Europe, many countries are pursuing best practices for different dimensions of importance for startups. Be it, for example, how quick, cheap, and easy it is to establish a company, how stock options are treated, the access to talent. For example, the ease with which visas are issued to high-tech talent from third countries. These sort of policies and initiatives are overseen by member states, not by the European Union institutions. So, Mircea, what we're trying to do with the European Union, the EU Startup Nation Standard, is to identify such best practices across Europe today. Provide the opportunity for those best practices to be shared between countries, between governments, between ministries, between agencies, so that they understand what they could be doing better, already what they are doing really well, but what they could do better for startups. And what we have done is we have identified in the EU Startup Nation Standard 8 areas of action, 8 pillars, where member states can take action under their national competencies that will help deliver better framework conditions for startups to stand up, start up, scale up, and ultimately exit. So the goal here, in a sentence after that longer introduction, is mobilize member states to share best practices, start implementing best practices they are not yet implementing, and bit by bit in these 8 areas become an EU startup nation. And then collectively, with a union of startup nations, we become the startup continent. That's that's the starting point. That's what we're trying to do with the
Okay.
EU Startup Nation Standard.
Let's actually go through each of these principles, which I think is very important to mention, maybe a couple of key points to each of them.
Sure, let me walk through these 8 pillars that have been identified for the EU Startup Nation Standard. In no order of priority: fast startup creation, smooth market entry, making it easier for an entrepreneur who's an innovator's come up with an idea. They think they could make a business out of this. They're putting together a team. Let's make it easy, cheap, and quick to create the startup, and not burdensome. Give them access to information to help them in those earliest of days. So let's call it a market access help desk. There's much more member states can be doing to make it cheaper, quicker, easier to start up and to understand what needs to be done in those earliest of days of a startup. Second pillar, attracting and retaining talent. Let's make it easier to issue visas and quicker for founders from third countries, supported by a trusted partner, to come in and set up a startup, and for experienced high-tech staff from third countries to get a visa so that they can work for a startup in an EU country. So also programs and incentives to encourage the return of EU tech talent who've emigrated to third countries. Romania has a massive diaspora of brilliantly talented engineers around the world. Wouldn't it be great to get them back and to create startups in Romania that go on to follow the inspiring role model of EU iPath? No, third pillar, stock options, how they are treated fiscally. We want, these are a real incentive for startups, for the employees, for them to pursue growth opportunities. Let's see how we can not dampen that tool, stock options, as an incentive. Innovation and regulation is the fourth pillar. Can we provide exemptions for startups in areas such as impact assessment, making it easier, remove burdens at an early stage in a startup, promote and allow experimentation for innovation in startups through regulatory sandboxes. The fifth pillar, and it's one of the ones that I'm particularly convinced of, is innovation procurement, including tech transfer policies. If you look at public procurement budgets, even historically, these have been a huge source of seed capital, if you wish, for the internet. We should be using in Europe the public procurement budgets to procure innovations from startups, and not just large enterprises or bigger players. Let's also give some of that procurement pie, so to speak, to startups. So we're seeking member states to, as a best practice, to commit to using some of their procurement budget that will be targeted to be given to startups in order to procure services, products that they have. We also want, through this, for tech transfer policies to be in place to smooth the passage of technology developed in universities and research institutions so that it can be transferred without obstacles to startups, spin-offs, and to lead to a new wave of venture building activity. The sixth pillar, access to finance. Yes, the capital is growing in Europe, but there is, as I mentioned earlier on, however, Mircea, there's a gap between the capital being raised by European startups and those, for example, in North America? Can we use member states to close that gap? For example, by using part of their recovery and resilience facility, this new funding from Brussels, from the EU, in light of the pandemic and the recovery that we now have to go through. Could they use some of that budget to enhance access to venture capital for startups? So public funding, and we've seen this in Brussels with our public funded programs. Public funding can become a leverage to mobilize more private investment in private capital off the sidelines. How about member states encouraging pension funds to start investing in more and more in high growth startups via VCs? There's an enormous amount of capital in Europe in pension funds, but so little of it is being invested in startups. Imagine we could get even 1% of that off the sidelines, even half. It would dramatically move the needle in terms of finance available for startups. Pension funds, think of it. The seventh of the 8 pillars is social inclusion, diversity, protecting democratic values. Let's not forget that the EU is not only about innovation and growth, but also about values and opportunities. So there's plenty of best practices out there for giving support to diversity and inclusion in startup policies while protecting democratic values. Promotion of role models. For example, giving awards that promote and recognize diversity in the startup community. Provision of incentive for startups to hire on basis of diversity of ethnicity, gender, religion, age, sexual orientation. Provision of support to founders from underprivileged backgrounds to create companies. And mobilizing startups to address marginalization, social inclusion, linked, for example, to low income, limited education, location, culture, or disability. That's the 7th pillar. And the 8th and final pillar of the EU Startups Nation Standard is digital first. Can we move to a world, certainly in this post-pandemic future that's ahead of us, for day-to-day interactions between startups and authorities being digital, in a digital-first manner, be it the company creation, filing of taxes, participation in procurement operations, digital signatures, and also engage with the startup and scale-up community to share knowledge and best practices regarding digitalization that governments, ministries, agencies can take up. So thanks for your patience there, Mirza, but they are the 8 pillars that are the cornerstones, the 8 cornerstones, if you wish, of the EU Startup Nation Standard.
And yeah, so basically we understood it was launched in spring and most of the member states signed it. I'm curious to understand what is the status quo at this moment and what are the specific things that will happen next year regarding the implementation of the standard.
Indeed. In March, it was launched with the support of 25 EU member states, ministerial level support, and Iceland from the EEA zone. So we have 26 countries, the vast majority of EU member states behind this, plus Iceland. So political support, the will to do this is crystal clear, which is really encouraging, not just for us in the EU institutions, but also for the startup community. Across the EU, there is political support for these 8 pillars that I've just been spreading to you. So be confident and reassured by that. In signing up to this initiative, one of the things that that is going to happen and is explicitly stated in the EU Startup Nation Standard Declaration is the establishment of a hub that will facilitate all of this, a hub that will bring together the signatory countries to share their best practices, to look also beyond to other corners of the world where there are best practices. Europe, best practices and all as we have them, we do not have a monopoly on this. There's some amazing things being done in the US or Singapore or South Korea or Israel. Let's identify those best practices. So a hub will be established legally in the coming months to kickstart this by bringing together the signatory countries, bringing in also inputs from the startup and scale-up community, from the startup ecosystem. Start sharing those best practices, creating a baseline. How are the member states doing today on these 8 dimensions? And then monitoring their progress over time as they start implementing best practices. And ultimately, this hope to start awarding the badge, the confirmed status of being an EU startup nation. We're already going to start reaching out now to member states, to the signatory countries, to create that baseline, to hear, where they are for these 8 different dimensions, what their plans are in terms of plugging the gaps. So we're already starting, even in advance of the hub being created, to start gathering in from the signatory countries how they see things today, what they have in place, and what they aspire to in the future.
I guess there will be many challenges coming on the way, and it's going to be a long process. But I'm curious, what do you think is the biggest challenge in terms of having this standard applied all over the EU and in Europe in general?
I think a big challenge is going to be every country is different. Every startup community has its own characteristics. There's going to be, difficulties maybe for some of these standards and some of the policy or politics or bureaucracy. There will be some speed bumps along the way, but I'm not worried about that, because the direction of travel is clear. It's forward. We've got compelling majority of countries on board. By the way, just to reassure you, Romania is one of the signatory countries. We have momentum here. We're going to have a hub that is got the resources to make this happen over time, to bring together, to convene the signatory countries and get them mobilized. And one of the kind of the elements that I think could be very effective here is that of competition, because the countries are going to be seeing how their peers, their other signatory countries are doing. They're going to see others progressing, others becoming the EU startup nation, and becoming a greater place for startups to grow and thrive. And we're confident that this will create a sense of competition, where the countries want to rise with their peers. And it will take some time, but nevertheless, we're going to hit the ground running in a matter of months once this entity is in place. So I think we will start seeing some really in the second half of this year. We're going to see lots of dynamic activity around this initiative. Of that, I'm confident.
Okay, and basically, this was a question coming from the audience, and now another question is, where can people can find more details about the concept, and is there a website that people could visit and read about all this and get informed?
Yeah, there's, for example, startupnationstandard.eu, which was actually created by the ecosystem, by some players in the startup ecosystem, which gives an overview of these 8 pillars, just as I did a few moments ago. But that's a good place to start. But we will, through our communication channels, we will be sharing much more information about the hub and the initiative in the coming months. But for anybody wanting to really get a feeling for what is in here, I would point you to startupnationstandard.eu.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually really happy to see this initiative, because I've been in the past 10 years in the startup ecosystem, and I saw how things are challenging, especially when it comes to growth of a startup from one country to the other, especially in Eastern Europe, where we have so many small markets and countries. So I think this is essential. And if in one phrase or 2 phrases to close the topic, what is your vision about the standard coming up, let's say in 10 years from now on? What would be the big picture, that the dream that you would see happening in Europe in 10 years related to this standard?
There's first of all, a massive growth in the number of unicorns in Europe by the end of this decade. That I think would be one powerful indicator that we're getting things right in Europe, not just in terms of funding, but also in terms of framework conditions. And indeed, in the same month that this was launched, the European Commission launched the Digital Decade, which sets out a series of goals to be achieved by the end of this decade, measurable goals, concrete stuff, not abstract. And one of those goals is that by the end of this decade, the number of unicorns in the EU has doubled.
Mhm.
For me, I think we have a great opportunity to indeed achieve that goal even before the end of this decade and exceed it by the end of this decade. And if we do so, I think it'll be because of the excellence in the ecosystem, a growth in financing, and improved framework conditions for startups. And improved framework conditions will come, I am hoping, I am confident, through the EU Startup Nations standard. So at least a doubling of unicorns by the end of this decade coming from the EU member states.
And this will actually drag the whole ecosystem up with other metrics, which will make Europe the best place to be in terms of startups, which I hope to see that coming. So thank you. Let's move on to the next topic, EU Innovation Radar Platform, which is quite an interesting platform and concept, especially that, as we said, we have many projects, many initiatives, many funding schemes, and let's dive into this. What is it, and why was it created?
Thanks, Mircea. You set it up there as a new topic, but I would actually argue that the Innovation Radar is tightly
Connected.
linked
Yeah.
with some of the EU Startup Nations standard. When I was starting out here today, I talked about the excellence in technological in terms of technology in Europe, in terms of scientific breakthrough, and that is not by accident that we are a powerhouse for such breakthroughs. Let's not forget, the world's biggest public-funded research and innovation program is the EU's framework program, Horizon 2020, about to be renewed for another 7 years at the end of 2021 as Horizon Europe. Flanking this, we also have massive investments, public-funded again, through regional programs, through member state research and innovation actions. So public funded research and innovation is a core foundation for the Europe startup community. And so if we have this massive public funded research and innovation program, Horizon 2020, we really need to make it easy to discover the innovative outputs of that program. And what the Innovation Radar is doing is taking a data-driven approach to identify the outputs of these tens of thousands of research projects and the actors behind them, and to allow for the results to be navigated in terms of their market potential, their market maturity, but also their disruptive potential. What is the potential for a given innovation to disrupt, to create new markets? So over the last 5 or so years in the Commission, we've been developing a methodology, data-driven, called the Innovation Radar, to categorize the outputs of the framework program, the innovations coming from out of this research program, and make them easier to navigate, easier to discover, easier to filter. And we do this through the public-facing side. We have innoradar.eu, plus smartphone apps, Android and iOS flavors. And then associated with that, we have supporting actions such as dealflow.eu. Dealflow.eu is a support action using to identify brilliant startups, SMEs, researchers coming out of the program and giving them support to make that step from the laboratory to the marketplace, be it in terms of introduction to investors, developing a business model, helping secure corporate partners, etc. So it's the Innovation Radar, in a sentence, is trying to make it easier for the world, be it investors, journalists, citizens, corporates, to discover the outputs of the world's biggest public funded research and innovation program. It's something that is constantly evolving and improving, adding new categories, merging with third-party data. For example, next week, we will be, certainly by the end of the month, it could be Monday the 31st of May, we're launching a new section on the website, Spotlight, where we're going to be dynamically identifying compelling opportunities in this massive growing data set. Already on the public funded website, there's over 7,500 unique innovations categorized by this method. So we want to make it easier to discover EU funded research and innovation excellence with the Innovation Radar. And in so doing, hopefully drive a new wave of startups and SMEs, the fuel of these startups and SMEs being these technological breakthroughs.
And the audience wants to know as well where they can find out details about this before closing the session. So it's innoradar.eu for the Innovation Radar, correct?
Not innovation, INNO, radar, in one word, .eu.
Yeah, we will post the links as well in the chat.
Brilliant. And also on the smartphone apps, Android and iOS, Innovation Radar.
And there basically we can find a search box and all the information we can search based on topics or various areas of interest and levels of the projects, and you can be matched with those. And for deal flow is dealflow.eu, which is also very interesting to find out, because I feel we need a platform where to see something else besides what's in our ecosystem in order to go towards open market and unitary market in our European ecosystem. Okay, so thank you very much, Mr. Eoghen O'Neill. I'm really happy to have you here and spread this information about it. And definitely we'll keep in touch and keep an eye on this. And now we will.
Innovation Days is part of the Future Skills lifelong learning program. The project is co-financed from the European Social Fund through the Human Capital Operational Program 2014-2020.